that. And a man who needs no introduction, one of our ILR favorites, Roy Hunt, will be giving our presentation for today. So welcome.
Well, thank you. And I don't know what's going on with my eyes today, but for some reason I can see better without my glasses than with them. So bear with me as I go through my notes. When we left Thomas Jefferson, his two daughters, Patsy and Polly, and his two slaves, brother and sister, Sally Hemings and James Hemings, in Paris. It was Halloween of 2022. This must have been, and they were waiting, they were all packed, and they were waiting to get word that they had passage to Virginia from England. And this must have been a trip from hell. And there was an article in the November 1872 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, which wrote of the trip, what a plague it was to get across the ocean 80 years ago. Well, although there were doubtless other reasons, the principal reason for Jefferson's request to Congress for a 6-month home leave seems to have been young love and a suitable match for his 16-year-old daughter, Patsy. In the summer of 1788, the Jeffersons received a visitor, Patsy's third cousin, Thomas Mann Randolph Jr., who spent several weeks with them in Paris. He had been studying at the University of Edinburgh and was on his way home. Well, during this period, the two apparently fell in love. They actually had known each other as children and played together. But after his departure to Virginia, Thomas Jefferson sought permission from Congress to return home for 6 months. And the primary reason was to hold an appropriate wedding at Monticello for Thomas and for Patsy. And this young suitor was, top line. The Randolphs were a big deal in Virginia. In fact, Thomas Jefferson himself was related through his mother. But young Thomas was a lineal descendant of Pocahontas through his mother. So again, an appropriate wedding at Monticello led to this request for home leave. Well, apparently there was absolute chaos in Congress at that time. And so Congress didn't get around to granting the request for several months. But by late September in 1789, Jefferson and his party were packed and anxiously waiting to leave. And by way of background, in my first lecture, is F forward?
Yeah, but sometimes that first slide sticks. I don't know why.
Well, no, I may not have done it right. That's it. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. By way of background, in my first lecture, you may remember that the Randolph family lived at Tuckahoe Plantation. This is a house where Thomas Jefferson lived for 6 years. You may also recall that Peter Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's father, had a very close friend, William Randolph III, who was the builder of this original plantation house at Tuckahoe. It's a house that can be visited today. And as I say, Peter was a close friend of William Randolph III. And in his 1745 will, which was made shortly before his death, William Randolph III stated, "My will is that my dear and loving friend, Mr. Peter Jefferson, do move down with his family to Tuckahoe House and remain there till my son comes of age." Well, this son was the father of Patsy's fiancee. In addition to this request, William Randolph III also made Jefferson the executor of his estate and made him guardian of the children. So further complicating this genealogy is the fact that Peter Jefferson's wife, Jane Randolph Jefferson, was William's first cousin. And the son referred to in William's will is Thomas Mann Randolph Sr., the father of Patsy Jefferson's fiance. As if that were not challenging enough, there were two Thomas Mann Randolph Jr.'s. Patsy's Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. was the first son of Thomas Mann Randolph III by his first wife. And there were lots of children. Thomas Mann Randolph Sr. and his first wife had 13 children in all, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. And within and the 13th child apparently killed the first Mrs. Randolph. And within a few months after her death, Thomas III, who was 53 years old and a widower, married a 17-year-old woman, much to the displeasure of the surviving children of the first wife. And that resulted in 2 children, a daughter who was stillborn, and then a son. And the 17-year-old second wife mandated that he also be named Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. So finally, I clarified that issue. I kept running across Thomas Mann Randolph Jr., and the dates didn't seem to work. But that's what happened. And as a result of this second marriage and second Thomas Mann Randolph Jr., the original family never again set foot into Tuckahoe. And Thomas Mann Randolph Sr. changed his will and left Tuckahoe to the second Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. So that's enough for the characters relevant to Patsy's marriage. Again, to the first Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. And Patsy Patsy was marrying the grandson of the child raised by her grandparents, Peter and Jane Randolph Jefferson. Well, in order to get home from Paris, and then we saw another photo of Tuckahoe, and this addition took place during the 6 years that Thomas Jefferson and his family were staying as stewards, if you will, until the majority of Peter Randolph Sr. Is that all right? Can you hear now? Okay. In order to get home from Paris, Jefferson had to charter a ship in London, which was to pick them up at the Isle of Wight at Cowes. And Jefferson and his party finally left Paris on August the 26th for Le Havre, where they were then detained 10 days from crossing the English Channel to the Isle of Wight due to bad weather. You can imagine how anxious they were. But of course, Thomas Jefferson took the time to measure everything in Le Havre and figure out their exports and imports. But at 12:30 a.m. on October the 8th, their passage boat across the channel sailed, and they arrived on the Isle of Wight early in the morning, 2 a.m. on October the 9th. Well, of course, that was not the end of it, because there was another 10-day delay on the Isle of Wight. But this gave Jefferson and his daughters a chance to explore the Isle of Wight. And the then Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, had the politeness to send an order to Coase saying that the Jefferson's enormous amount of baggage was exempt from search. But finally, on October the 24th, the party boarded the Claremont bound for Norfolk, Virginia. And they had 23 days of perfect sailing weather, and it brought them to the coast of Virginia, where there was such a dense fog that they could not enter Chesapeake Bay for 3 days. And finally, on the 4th day, apparently at the urging of Jefferson, the captain managed to slip into Chesapeake Bay, where very quickly another ship hit them and destroyed part of their rigging. The ships that did not slip in that day had to remain at sea another month before the fog lifted enough to get into Chesapeake Bay. Well, once they got to Norfolk, which was on November the 18th, 1789, 2 hours after the passengers had disembarked and before any of the Jefferson baggage had been offloaded, the ship caught on fire. And only the thickness of the baggage of the Jeffersons saved their precious belongings that they were bringing back from France. Norfolk, which had been burned to the last house during the recent revolution, was basically a village of shanties. There was only one inn in Norfolk, which was, of course, full, but guests staying there insisted on vacating and giving way to the Jeffersons. And on that very day when they arrived, Jefferson saw a newspaper which announced that George Washington had appointed him the first permanent Secretary of State. And it is said that Jefferson didn't pay much attention to it at the time, but friends lent them horses and carriages, and with stopping at the homes of friends along the way, they reached Richmond in 10 days. And there, the legislature was in session, and nothing would do but the Jeffersons remain in Richmond long enough to be officially celebrated. And certainly Jefferson must have been delighted that this was done in the building that he had designed based on the Maison Carrée in Nîmes. This was the model that he took for the Virginia State Capitol when he was asked to design it. So they finally got going again, and this time they stopped at the mansion of the person was called Uncle Epps, but it was Francis Epps, who was the brother-in-law of Jefferson's wife, Patty. And this was in Chesterfield County. And this is the home where Polly had been until her father sent for her to come to Paris with Sally Hemings. So there was a great homecoming there. And it was there at Eppington that Jefferson received the official appointment as permanent Secretary of State. Well, they were 6 weeks altogether in getting from Norfolk to Monticello, and they arrived 2 days before Christmas in the late afternoon, and apparently there was a riotous reception, and the slaves ended up carrying Jefferson up the hill on their shoulders. So a Merry Christmas was had, apparently. And then the serious business of getting ready for the wedding took place. The wedding occurred on February the 23rd, 1790, and the young couple settled on land near Monticello. Well, for a single week, Jefferson was able to enjoy the company of the family, but then in obedience to President Washington, he set out for New York because, of course, Congress originally met in New York. The weather was apparently horrible at that time of year, but he finally arrived there on March the 21st. And this was the beginning of a new phase of his life. And Congress would not move from New York City to Philadelphia until July of that year, July 1790. And so Congress' third session convened in Philadelphia on December the 6th, 1790. Finally, on June the 11th, 1800, Philadelphia ceased to be the nation's capital, and the District of Columbia was now the nation's permanent capital. Well, settled in Philadelphia as the first permanent Secretary of State, John Jay was the first, but he was not permanent. He declined. He wanted to be the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and Washington agreed to that. So again, Jefferson became the first permanent Secretary of State. And he was responsible, as part of his job, for the early planning and surveying of the nation's capital district. And in 1791, he presented his plan for the new federal district. However, it was George Washington and 3 commissioners appointed by him who, in March 1791, appointed L'Enfant, who you remember was a French engineer who had fought in our revolution. And so these commissioners and Washington appointed L'Enfant to map out the new city. And from the very start, Jefferson and L'Enfant had basic differences, with L'Enfant envisioning a far more grandiose plan, including a presidential palace, which would have been 6 times larger than the present White House. Well, I guess this was fortunate for Jefferson, but Washington dismissed L'Enfant in 1792 for obstinacy in denying the city's 3 commissioners their requests for some changes. So during L'Enfant's term as planner, Jefferson first thrust upon him, really, the models that he had brought back from Paris. You recall from the first 2 lectures that he collected favorite buildings and plans of them with the idea that they would be used in building the new capital. And this, in turn, led to our nation's capital's overwhelmingly Greek and Roman classical architecture. But this architecture has been filtered through the classical architecture of Paris, thanks to Jefferson's 5 years in Paris. As to the overall layout of the federal district, there's a common belief that it's based upon the circles and broad avenues of Paris. In fact, the Paris we see today gained its present layout only after Napoleon III hired Baron Haussmann as his Robert Moses in 1853. And this period from 1853 till the fall of Napoleon III in 1870 is when the Paris we know today emerged. Someone asked me, since it was Napoleon III, but the Second Empire, was there a Napoleon II? Well, there indeed was, but he reigned for a few days in 1815 and then was exiled and spent the rest of his life, I think, in Austria. Well, despite his busy public life between 1790 as Secretary of State, Vice President under John Adams, and 2 terms as President from 1801 to 1809, Jefferson made time to engage in his favorite activity. I think I mentioned this in a previous lecture, but Jefferson famously said, "Putting up and pulling down is one of my favorite amusements." Well, in 1794, he began pulling down Monticello 1. Of course, there are no photographs. We don't even have a good watercolor. This is a sketch that he did of Monticello 1. And you will immediately notice the Doric columns on the first floor and the Ionic columns on the second floor. So it's really a very Palladian house, although without the wings you usually find with the Palladian structures in the Veneto. So again, this looks nothing like Monticello 2, and Monticello 2 is the building we all associate with Jefferson, I think. In 1794, he began pulling down Monticello 1, which had been built between 1765 and 1773, and he began putting up Monticello 2. And this was a process that took basically from 1794 to 1808, although he really never finished it because he was always changing things. But basically, we can think of those dates: 1794, the beginning; 1808, the substantial completion. Well, although Monticello 2 shows many French influences, it's overwhelmingly influenced by the Hôtel de Somme, which we looked at earlier. This is in Paris, and beyond it, on the left there, is the what's now the Musée d'Orsay, the old train station. But again, I'll back up if I can, so you can look at that and then look at the Hôtel de Somme and see how strong the influence is. The exterior was the appearance from the outside. The thing that is so notable about it is it looks like it's one story. And so does Monticello. On the interior, he adopted the Parisian rejection of a grand staircase in favor of smaller, steeper staircases in order to maintain or to gain interior space. And the most dramatic example of what he was rejecting may be the hall at the Marble Hall at the Earl of Leicester's Holkham Hall in Norfolk, England, which was completed about 30 years prior to Monticello 2. And the amazing thing is that both Jefferson and Holkham Hall's architects professed Palladio as their architectural god. I was in this home shortly before the pandemic, and it's pretty overwhelming. Well, again, this was totally rejected by Jefferson, even though they both claimed to be following Palladio. Well, during the years as Washington's Secretary of State, Jefferson butted heads with Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, over the direction in which the new nation should go. As you probably remember from your study of history, Jefferson wanted an agrarian society with limited central government. Hamilton wanted a more commercial nation with strong federal authority over the states. And this split led to the development of our two political parties. Well, 3 years of turmoil in the cabinet led Jefferson to resign in 1793 and return to Monticello, which of course permitted him to start pulling down and putting up Monticello II. For the next few years, he rarely left Monticello, and this left him free for the serious business of building. As earlier mentioned, the exterior of Monticello II draws heavily upon the Hotel de Somme in Paris. Monticello's dome and the dome room likely pay tribute to the Marché aux Bleds, which we saw earlier. This in Paris, it's recently become a venue for contemporary art. But this exterior, and I wish we could see the top of the dome here, but this is the way it's being used now as an art venue down, and that's the main gallery down below. But at the time that Jefferson visited it, it had acquired a dome that a series of wooden ribs with glass in between. That's not what is there now. It was modified because of leaks probably 100 years ago. But in any event, it strongly influenced Jefferson and probably influenced the dome that's on Monticello and the skylight there. Then the pulling down of Monticello I occupied the years 1794 to 1796. And then the putting up occupied the years 1796 to 1808, late in Jefferson's second term as president. A look at the floor plan as drawn by the well-known American architect Robert Mills in 1803 shows Jefferson's love affair with the octagon. As you'll see, there are octagons all over the floor plan. And this was a lifelong fascination, which is found in several buildings we're going to be looking at. But why this fascination or this love for the octagon? Well, apparently the geometry of octagons appealed to his mathematical mind. And there was a practical reason as well. Octagonal rooms, which are when they're studied with large windows, often triple sash, which he again brought back from Paris, they create light-filled inner spaces, and he also frequently used skylights for that purpose. So he was always concerned about light and ventilation. And again, octagonal rooms permitted more openings. Well, being president seemed to pose no impediment to Jefferson's favorite amusement. And in 1802, well, I should have, here's, even in the furniture, this is a workstation, if you will, in the library at Monticello, which he designed as an octagon. And it's very ingenious because each of the drawers open, they're angled in some fashion. And if you look at the top right, you can actually see, and this is not painted on, this is inlaid, A to C. So the correspondence from somebody whose name was A to C went in that drawer. So again, the octagon appears repeatedly in everything he seemed to do. But in 1802, early in the first term as president, one of his friends, the owner of Farmington Plantation near Charlottesville, and the house originally was built between 1760 and 1780 by a prior owner, but the owner in 1802 asked Jefferson to design an expansion of his home. And this is an elongated octagon, which was added to the front along with the portico and columns that we see there. We have a facade which consists of an elongated octagon with its long axis perpendicular to the large tetrastyle Tuscan portico, or tetrastyle meaning four columns, Tuscan columns in the front. Since 1927, Farmington has served as a country club, and the members there zealously guard the Jefferson design, so it is certainly in no danger. I suppose they have fire suppression system there. I was lucky enough to have dinner there about 20 years ago, and again, it was a spectacular Jeffersonian success. And circumstances suggest that a second iteration of Farmington in Louisville, Kentucky, constructed in 1816, was also designed by, this is the interior design on the left of Farmington in Virginia. You see the elongated octagon in front there. But this is a house in Louisville, Kentucky, which I have visited. It's a house museum now. And there's nothing in the official record to say that Jefferson was the designer, but it was built for the niece of the owner of Virginia's Farmington, who was also the granddaughter of Dr. Thomas Walker, who was the legal guardian of Jefferson after the untimely death of his father, Peter. And so the family has always claimed that Jefferson did the floor plan, the design. And again, although there's nothing about the exterior except that bay on the left that suggests octagon, if you look at the floor plan, you see that what we have are two octagons, and looking from the front door to the back terrace, basically you're looking through octagons. So it's entirely likely that Jefferson did this. Of course, he never was in Louisville, but this is a house museum today. Jefferson continued to design homes for friends after his presidency, and almost always with an octagon central to the plan. One of my favorites is the house he designed in 1814 for a friend and former Virginia governor named Barber, and it's in a very small outskirts of a very small village called Barbersville. The house's drawing room, and we're looking actually from the front right now, but the house's drawing room was a large octagon and was designed with Monticello II in mind. Here is the rear looking into the octagon. And here you can see from an aerial just how important the octagon is. This is the view from the parlor looking out the back of the house. Sadly, the house burned on Christmas Day, 1884. And today it's a romantic, evocative, preserved ruin, which was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1969. And incidentally, if you happen to be there, this is where Barbersville Vineyards are located with the Palladio restaurant. And so, and in fact, right next to the ruin is a house which is probably an 1850s house, which is a B&B. So it's a great place to stay and explore the vineyards, the restaurant, and the preserved ruin. Jefferson's supreme use of the octagon, well, I'm getting a, let's see, I'll have to come back to these. Jefferson's supreme use of the octagon, however, is poplar forest, and I'm going to skip. Well, it's poplar forest, and its interior restoration has recently been completed after 23 years of work. It's located technically in a suburb of Lynchburg called Forest, but it is part of greater Lynchburg, Virginia today. And in this restoration, period building techniques and special tools have been used throughout the 23 years. And arguably, this is the nation's finest historical restoration. It's been undertaken by the same architect for the entire 23 years. And now that he has completed it, he is retiring. He was one of the participants on my trip exploring Jefferson's France in May. Well, Poplar Forest is a quintessential villa as defined by Andrea Palladio. Jefferson's architectural god, as you remember, he proclaimed his god, architectural. Well, villas designed by Palladio are sprinkled around the countryside between Vicenza and Venice, built between 1540 and 1580. The idea of the villa was the embodiment of a classical idea, the Roman villa retreat, a home in the country designed for pleasure and repose, a place where owner and guests can forget the cares of the everyday world. Well, with Palladio's villas, sometimes there is a working farm attached, but they're not the primary residences of the owners. So Monticello really would not be considered a villa, but under that definition, but very much Poplar Forest is. And in looking at the continuity of the villa concept, and I'll back up. Falling Water is arguably the most important villa in our country. It was strictly built for repose and entertainment by the owner of a large department store in Pittsburgh, done by Frank Lloyd Wright. And I was there again just about 6 weeks ago, and it's really overwhelming. But again, it's a villa in the Roman classical sense. A second one, which was designed by Mies van der Rohe for a woman doctor in Chicago, is again a villa. Mies actually designed this, and the design was known before the next one I'm going to show you, Philip Johnson's Glass House. But Philip Johnson acknowledges his debt to Mies van der Rohe. And here you can see it's on raised piers called pilotis. And it's facing a small river. And that's a major problem because since the National Trust acquired this property at an auction, paying about $6 million for it, it has 3 times flooded. But it is an icon, and it is a villa. The third one I want to show you is Philip Johnson's Glass House in Connecticut. And you can see the debt he owes to Mies van der Rohe, but it is not raised on pilotis. And all 3 of these houses, Falling Water, the house Mies did, and Philip Johnson's house are National Historic Landmarks. And now all 3 are open to the public. So the idea, the concept of the villa is very much with us still. Jefferson attempted to to establish retreats wherever he was. When he was in Paris, there was a particular, not a monastery, but up in the hills, there was a religious center where he would go for 2 weeks at a time. And it was not hard living. I mean, the people who were there in retreat would get together for drinks every night and socialize. But from a very early point, Jefferson found it important to have a retreat. And it's my theory that the first successful attempt came about as a result of the death of his father-in-law, John Wales, in May of 1773, and as a result of the English doctrine of coverture, which was still recognized in colonial Virginia at the time, he immediately inherited the property, the 4,000 acres that is Poplar Forest. And at the time, the only structure there was an overseer's house. Well, the natural bridge of Virginia is only 27 miles from Poplar Forest as the crow flies. And I think Jefferson saw this as a future retreat. The natural bridge patent was surveyed in 1750 by George Washington. And then Thomas Jefferson had his first visit there in August of 1767 when he sketched the bridge and recorded its dimensions and setting. It still can be seen on the inside back cover of his memorandum book. And Jefferson praised the natural bridge as, quote, the most sublime of nature's works, unquote. Well, in 1773, shortly after he had acquired Poplar Forest, he successfully began negotiation with agents of King George III to purchase it. It took about a year and a half, but he succeeded, and he was the first American owner, patenting it with 157 acres on July the 5th, 1774. Well, despite later financial pressures which led to the sale of many of his properties, Jefferson always refused to sell Natural Bridge, viewing his ownership as a public trust. 3 years after his death, it was sold and settling his estate, and it remained in private ownership until 2016, when it became a Virginia State Park. I can recall when I was 18 going there the first time, and back in those days, it was considered one of the most important places to visit as a tourist in the United States, certainly the eastern part of the United States. I think people don't even know where it is today, because US 11, which actually goes over the bridge and has since 1926, US 11 was bypassed by I-81, and people just whiz on up to Washington without even knowing this is there. I took my grandson and some of my great-grandsons there about 8 years ago, I think. And the big old red brick hotel, some of you may remember, was still there and functioning. But that was the only thing. But I say the bridge still looks just like this, and you don't even notice US 11 crossing it. In any event, once, I guess we need to know about Poplar Forest. See if back to Poplar Forest. This is perhaps the most wholly individualistic of all Jefferson's designs. And actual construction on Poplar Forest began in 1806, and work on Monticello II was simultaneous with the construction of Poplar Forest. And under the circumstances of his ever worsening financial situation, it was an extraordinary and perhaps a stupid undertaking to build this retreat at Poplar Forest. Poplar Forest was a 2.5-day carriage ride from Monticello. And of course, with his passion for measuring everything, we know that it was exactly 93 miles as measured by an odometer attached to Jefferson's carriage, which had a bell that rang at intervals. He didn't always go by carriage. If he were not taking granddaughters with him, he would ride horseback, which would be a little bit faster. But in any event, for the design of his retreat, he chose the octagon, an octagon 50 feet in diameter. We've already seen that Jefferson's fascination with this shape began in the 1760s. And while the symmetry and precision of the approach here which was pleasing to his mathematical mind, it also increased the exposure area for windows, triple hung sash. And inside, the space is divided into 4 elongated octagons surrounding a central square, which is a perfect cube measuring 20 feet in all directions, and with a skylight that ran the length of the 20 feet. It's lit from above, say, by the skylight and the exquisite light streaking in there. Poplar Forest was, as I say, his ultimate octagon, and it was Jefferson's only fully octagonal building. Even the domed octagonal privies are octagonal, 2 of them, one on each side. And Poplar Forest was one of the first, if not the first, octagonal homes in America. Some of you may be familiar with a structure near the White House called the Octagon, which was designed by Dr. William Thornton, the first architect of the Capitol, in 1799. But it's actually, and it's owned by the American Institute of Architects now. It's their official headquarters. But it's not really an octagon. It's actually a circle with 2 rectangles and a triangle. But again, it's always been called the octagon since its building. So that's a little bit confusing. So it certainly is earlier than Poplar Forest by a few years, but just to remember, it's a lie. It's not an octagon. Well, Poplar Forest, like Monticello too, owes much to Jefferson's 5 years in France. Back to the front facade, the influence of the Hotel de Somme is apparent on the buildings, which appears to be a simple single story from the west front, I think, which is the entry. But the house is set into a hilltop grade, which permits a lower service floor invisible from the entrance. And it also permits windows and doors in the reverse slope. So both the long skylight in the cube, the dining room, and the floor-to-ceiling windows in the parlor are French touches. And in classical architecture, a building or a room's order determines the proportions and appearance of its columns, its capitals, its entablature, its decorative trim. And for the exterior of Poplar Forest, Jefferson used the Tuscan order, the simplest of the orders. It provides a sense of naturalness and integrity. And adhering to the proper hierarchy, Jefferson used the Doric order on the central cube, if I can get to it. This is actually taken from the Baths of Diocletian in Rome. And this is the way it looks in Rome. where you have the triglyphs and the metopes. And this is the ox skull, which was so favored, the bucranium. Sorry about that. In any event, the design is based on the Roman baths of Diocletian, which alternated two elements, human faces carved in low relief and triglyphs, a grill really of vertical bars common to all Doric friezes. But at Poplar Forest, Jefferson broke the rules, adding a third classical element. So he had ox skulls, and he had, see if I can find it. This is called Curly Apollo. So he had faces and ox skulls. And when the sculptor received this commission, he was very confused by the fact that Jefferson was not following the classical rules. And Jefferson said that while he felt he had to follow authority strictly with respect to public buildings, that this was his private building, and he felt he could follow his fancy and do this revolutionary thing with the decoration and the entablature. And the accurate replication of this original frieze was possible due to archaeology. They discovered their original faces in ox skulls when they were doing archaeology, and they're amazing. They're made of individually cast pieces, which are then painted white and installed in parts with screws in the entablature. And again, this was followed in the restoration. Well, as a Poplar Forest coda, Jefferson could no longer travel to Poplar Forest after 1823. And that year, he settled his grandson, Polly's son, there with his bride. When Jefferson died in 1826, the grandson, Francis Epps, inherited. And this has an interesting Florida connection, because within 2 years, Epps sold the property, which had been absolutely worn out through growing tobacco. Also, the roof leaked, the skylight leaked. But he sold it and moved his family and his slaves to Tallahassee, where he became a very important person. He was twice mayor of Tallahassee and was considered a founder of what's now FSU. And then, strangely to me, I never found out why he was in Orlando, but he died in Orlando in May of 1881, and he's buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Orlando. So now finally to Jefferson's academical village, the recreation of which Jefferson called, or the creation of which Jefferson called his last act of usefulness. On the verge of his death, he designed his own epitaph, which appears on his stone: author of the Declaration of Independence, the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. He omitted serving as president, vice president, secretary of state. These are the things he thought most important. So over a period of 50 years, I've made several short visits to the university and the lawn, which the rotunda and the 10 pavilions face. And always I came away with the impression of symmetry. But this impression changed about 10 years ago, when my grandson and two of my great-grandsons were guests at Pavilion 7, which was actually the first pavilion built. You can see his plan here with the rotunda up above, and this is sloping down, and 5 pavilions on either side. Well, after staying there for several days and in the late afternoon, walking around with plenty of time, I realized that the last thing in the world there was absolute symmetry. Symmetry in terms of the overall plan. And this, incidentally, is the way it looks after the Board of Governors in 1895 hired the New York firm that Stanford White was with to do the buildings that you see at the bottom there. And this destroyed the view that of the hills that Jefferson was so intent upon preserving, but that's the way it is. This is Pavilion 7. Again, it's the first pavilion that was built. And my grandson and great-grandson's enjoying the lawn, which it's an outdoor living room, which was so very, very different from when I taught at Trinity College, Cambridge. This is the Christopher Wren Library. This green was absolutely sacrosanct. If a student set foot on it, he would probably disappear during the night. So UVA is much more user-friendly. I discovered, again, Pavilion 7. Then it was a teaching device for Jefferson, and that's why there's the lack of symmetry. His the project, which began in 1817 and lasted until his death in 1826, and as you recall, his friend and sometimes nemesis John Adams died within hours of his death on Independence Day, 1826. Although he was assisted by 2 other architects, Benjamin Latrobe, whom he had appointed surveyor of public buildings during his presidential administration, and William Thornton, who did the Octagon, but also was the architect for the Capitol. The overall vision was certainly pure Jefferson, and Jefferson termed the basic plan an academical village. And he planned that U-shaped with 10 pavilions, 5 on each side, anchored by a central building, with the whole enclosing a green space on 3 sides. The south end, as I say, was left open to provide views of the surrounding hills. That was destroyed in 1895. But the thought was that these would serve as teaching devices. And looking at the 1825 ground plan, as I say, one is struck by the symmetry, but while the lawn's ground plan may be symmetrical, the buildings are anything but. They're wildly different, although they're always defined by Greek or Roman classicism, filtered through Palladio and models Jefferson collected in Paris. Jefferson made clear in describing the lawn's 10 pavilions that they were to serve a didactic function, that of exhibiting models and architecture of the purest forms of antiquity, furnishing to the student examples of the precepts he will be taught in that art. So he intended that all the students be taught classical architecture with these buildings to look at. So he believed that central to any university or college would be excellent examples of classical architecture. So once the lawn's ground plan was established, Jefferson asked both Thornton and Latrobe to make suggestions for the design of the pavilions. And Thornton responded first, and when the cornerstone was laid for the first pavilion. Again, confusingly, it's now called Pavilion 7. But the cornerstone was laid in October of 1817, and Jefferson had combined Thornton's suggestions with his own and based its order on the Doric of Palladio and Vitruvius. Well, Jefferson had made clear to both Thornton and Latrobe that he wanted pavilions of a variety of appearance, no two alike, so as to serve as specimens for the architectural lectures, quote from him. Well, 2 days after the cornerstone was laid for Pavilion 7, Latrobe's drawings finally arrived. And Jefferson immediately informed Latrobe he would select 2 of his fronts for the Ionic and Corinthian pavilions that would be built next. And Jefferson then abandoned Thornton's schemes for the remaining pavilions on the lawn. This is Pavilion 2, as I recall, and you can see that is in the Ionic style. So that was one of the ones that that Latrobe provided. As fully completed, 6 of the lawn's 10 pavilions represent what we call the giant order. In other words, the columns are 2 stories high. And these are from a Latrobe sheet of drawings. Finally, the lawn centerpiece, the rotunda, would be a library, not a chapel. So he was rejecting what happened on every other campus where the chapel was the central feature. It was very much a collaboration between Jefferson and Latrobe. And on the back of Jefferson's plan for the dome room, Jefferson acknowledged that he had based the design for the rotunda on the Pantheon in Rome. Here we have the Pantheon. And although Jefferson never made it to Rome during his time in Europe, he was familiar with the ancient temple from the drawings in Palladio's 4 books of architecture. And coincidentally, the Pantheon was built by the same soldier statesman who was responsible for the building of the Maison Carrée in Nîmes. With the rotunda, Jefferson scaled down the design in Rome to fit the site. The rotunda is approximately half the size of the Pantheon, and the rotunda's portico is only 6 columns wide, whereas the Pantheon has 8 columns. It's in the interior dome room where the French connection is most striking. Back up a little. This is in the dome room. The 40 paired columns are reminiscent of those on the Louvre's Grand East Colonnade. As you recall, that was considered revolutionary at the time. And then the ribbing on the dome in the dome room, the ribbing of the oculus, recalls his excitement at seeing the glass dome at the Bourse du Commerce. The 3 rooms on the first 2 floors below the dome room echo the interior layout of the so-called ruined column at the Désert de Retz that he visited while he was in Paris. Each of those floors has basically 3 ovals. And so the first 2 floors in the rotunda copied that. So it's somehow appropriate that The French Connection climaxed on November the 5th, 1824, with the inaugural ceremony of the University of Virginia. 400 guests gathered for a banquet in the yet unfinished rotunda. And at the conclusion, Jefferson's special guest, the Marquis de Lafayette, who almost 50 years earlier had come to America to help with our revolution, and later in 1784 introduced Jefferson to Paris, rose and toasted Jefferson as, quote, the founder of the University of Virginia. And it is said that Jefferson wept. That's the end. Any questions?
Okay, hold on.
I think that's Richard. I'll put my glasses back on. No.
Just a quick comment. One of the activities of Jefferson, among many others, is the Louisiana Purchase. And if you were to go to the University of Missouri, Columbia, on that campus is the original obelisk of Jefferson's burial place, with the small inscription that you described, omitting the building of the University of Virginia. And of course, the capital of the state of Missouri is Jefferson City. So in this Louisiana Purchase area, one state that was prominent on the Mississippi and the Missouri River, namely Missouri, has taken the connection of Jefferson creating the Louisiana Purchase as a memento that really opened the West, and of course the arches in St. Louis comment on the opening of the West brought about by Louisiana Purchase. One other comment quickly about the University of Virginia versus its rival, William and Mary. William and Mary has architecture of the Wren Building from a British Wren architect versus Jefferson. So there's a kind of an interesting architectural play of Old England and the Wren at William and Mary versus Jefferson interpretation of French architecture at the University of Virginia. And those two are very big rivals today.
Well, I mentioned this, I think, in the first lecture. The Wren Building may or may not have been designed by Wren. That's not certain. In any event, Jefferson was actually asked to redesign the Wren Building, and the revolution got in the way. Jefferson was not a fan of the Wren Building as designed. He said very ugly things about it. But yes, the Capitol in Jefferson City is interesting for many reasons. One, the spectacular Robert Hart Benton murals there. So it's worth the trip there to see those. Are there any other questions? Okay.
Just one comment, Roy. I'm back here. I just want to thank you for this interesting talk. I was fascinated with Jefferson's fascination with octagon-shaped buildings. And the reason that I'm so interested in it is because I saw a picture of an area on the west coast of Florida after Hurricane Charlie came through. Mm-hmm. And a round structure, there was virtually no damage. And the traditional square and rectangular had tremendous damage. And I'm just thinking the octagon would probably be similar to round. when there's hurricane conditions. Thank you.
That's a very interesting observation because I had not run across any suggestion of that in anything I read, but it's certainly possible.
Any other questions on Zoom? I don't see any hands. Anybody else here? Well, Roy, we thank you again.
Well, thank you for being here. I've learned a lot about the Jefferson family. I'm surprised that the Virginians are not all idiots. They intermarried so frequently. Thank you. I forgot to thank Julianne. Without Julianne, I would not have done any of the lectures I've done.
Oh, there we go.